Step away from that chart. Who told you that you could even open it? Dr. Marcus Vantree pulled the folder out of Renee Webb's hands before she could answer. A cleaning woman, latex gloves still damp from wiping down a bedside table. He held the chart up like evidence. This is a patient's medical record, not something for you to browse on your lunch break. 6 people in the hallway turned to look. A resident lowered his coffee cup. Vantree's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. You know what? Since you clearly think you know better than the department that trained at Columbia and Johns Hopkins, present it. Friday's tumor board. If you're wrong, I'll have hospital security escort you out for practicing medicine without a license. And if somehow you're right, he let the pause stretch, enjoying it. I'll resign as chief on the spot, in front of everyone. Jordan Reyes, the resident, froze mid-sip. Renee looked at the chart still in Vantree's hand, then at him. She set down her cleaning cloth on the cart, wiped her palms on her uniform, and said, "All right." Silence. What none of them knew was that this woman had been reading patient charts on her breaks for 11 years, and this time she wasn't going to put the folder back and walk away. Sterling Memorial Hospital sat on the edge of a mid-sized Ohio city, 7 stories of glass and brick, a teaching hospital affiliated with a respected medical school, the kind of place where a resume mattered more than a diagnosis, and the right pedigree opened doors that competence alone never could. Renee Webb had worked in environmental services at Sterling Memorial for 15 years. Every weekday she clocked in at 7 a.m. and worked the day shift, cleaning patient rooms, restocking supply closets, wiping down the same rails and counters that doctors touched without ever looking at her twice. She wore a navy uniform with her name on a laminated badge. Nobody read it. To most of the staff, she was part of the hospital's furniture, present in every hallway and invisible in every room. But Renee had a habit nobody knew about. On her breaks, in the small windows between rooms, she read patient charts left open on rolling carts, and she thought about what she saw. Not idly, carefully, the way a person thinks about a puzzle they've been quietly solving their whole life. It started with her mother. Adeze Webb had been a fully trained physician in Lagos, Nigeria, before she immigrated to the United States when Renee was 12. In Nigeria, her medical license meant nothing. Recertification required years of unpaid retraining and exams she couldn't afford to take while raising 2 children alone after Renee's father stayed behind. So Adeze became a home health aide instead, bathing and feeding patients whose illnesses she understood better than the doctors who prescribed their medication. She never stopped thinking like a physician. In the evenings, she'd sit with Renee at the kitchen table and go through her old case notebook from Lagos, teaching her daughter to reason the way a diagnostician reasons. Not memorizing symptoms, but following a thread, asking what a body was actually telling you underneath what it seemed to be saying. Everybody sees the fever. Not everybody asks why the fever came at that hour and not another. Adeze died 6 years ago. Kidney failure, worsened by years of working double shifts to keep the lights on. She left behind a worn leather notebook full of case notes in her small, careful handwriting, and a daughter who had never stopped studying it. Renee never told anyone at Sterling Memorial. She read the charts, she thought. She kept her thoughts to herself and cleaned the rooms and went home. Until Marcus Vantree arrived. He'd transferred in 8 months earlier from a hospital in Boston. 34 years old, chief of internal medicine, the youngest to hold the position in Sterling Memorial's history. He wore his white coat like a uniform of rank, moved through the hallways like he expected the floor to acknowledge him, and he'd built his entire identity around the idea that intelligence had a pedigree, the right school, the right training, the right name on the door. He was, by every measure that mattered to him, brilliant. The question was whether he believed anyone outside his world could be. For 3 weeks, the department had been stuck on a patient in room 412, a 52-year-old man with a cluster of symptoms that didn't fit any of the standard frameworks. 2 specialists had already been consulted. Every proposed diagnosis had been tested and ruled out. Vantree grew visibly frustrated, snapping at residents in rounds, treating the unsolved case as a personal insult rather than a medical puzzle. Renee had been cleaning room 412 every morning for 3 weeks. She'd overheard enough of the rounds conversations, seen enough of the chart left open on the rolling tray, to notice something nobody in the room seemed to be asking. It reminded her of a page in her mother's notebook, a case from Lagos decades old, involving a symptom pattern that looked like one disease but behaved like another entirely, because everyone kept anchoring to the more common explanation instead of the rarer, correct one. She mentioned it to Jordan Reyes quietly, almost apologetically on a Tuesday morning while restocking gloves outside the room. "Has anyone checked whether it could be—" And she said the name of the condition, plainly, the way her mother used to say things. Jordan blinked. That's not a bad thought." Vantree, walking past at exactly that moment, heard it. He stopped. He turned, and that was the moment the chart came out of Renee's hands and the hallway went quiet, and the dare that would define the next 14 days of both their lives got said out loud in front of witnesses neither of them could take back. By that afternoon, the story had already made its way through 3 departments. Nobody had recorded it, but it didn't need a camera to spread. A cleaning woman corrected a resident's diagnosis in front of the chief of medicine, and the chief of medicine had bet his own job on her being wrong. If you've ever had a moment where you said something true out loud and immediately understood there was no putting it back, that's exactly where Renee was standing in that hallway, and it's exactly where this story really begins. So let me ask you something before we go further. Wherever you're watching this from tonight, whatever's going on in your own life that made you click on a story like this one, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Because stories like this aren't really about one hospital in Ohio. They're about every person watching right now who's ever known something true and been told to stay quiet about it anyway. Say hello. Let me know you're here. Because what happens over these next 14 days is the reason people are still going to be talking about this hospital years from now. Vantree made it official before the end of the day. He walked into the environmental services break room himself, which staff later said they'd never once seen him do, and found Renee alone at the laminate table eating her lunch. "I want this in writing," he said, sliding a printed sheet across the table. "Friday's tumor board. 14 days from today, actually, since I've decided to give the department a fair runway to evaluate your claim properly. You'll present your diagnosis in full, with reasoning, to the assembled specialists. If it doesn't hold up, Human Resources will process your termination for violation of scope of practice policy. If it does," his jaw tightened around the words, "I resign as chief, effective immediately, in the same room." Renee looked at the sheet, then at him. "Why 14 days? Why not just say no right now?" "Because I want it clear to everyone in this hospital that I gave you every chance," Vantree said, "and I want it clear to you that I'm not worried." He left without waiting for her answer. That evening, Renee sat at her kitchen table with her mother's notebook open in front of her for the first time in months. The leather cover was cracked soft at the spine. Ada's handwriting filled page after page, dates, symptoms, small diagrams, a case near the middle marked with 3 stars that Renee had never fully understood until 3 weeks ago in room 412. She read it 3 times. Then she picked up a pencil and began writing her own notes in the margin, the way her mother had taught her. Not what the textbook said the disease should look like, but what this particular body was actually telling anyone patient enough to listen. The next morning, word of the wager had reached the medical students. A whiteboard in the resident lounge had "Cleaner versus Chief" scrawled at the top in dry erase marker, with a running tally of who believed what. The tally favored Vantree 11-2. Jordan Reyes was one of the 2. He found Renee in the hallway outside room 412 on day 2 and spoke to her quietly, checking over her shoulder first. "I looked up what you said yesterday. The condition. It's rare, really rare, but it fits better than anything on the differential we've been running." He paused. "I could lose my residency for saying this to you, so I need you to actually be right." "I need that too." Day 3, Renee began spending her lunch breaks in the hospital's small medical library instead of the break room, cross-referencing what she remembered from her mother's notebook against the actual literature. Most of what she found confirmed the shape of what Adeze had taught her decades earlier, but one gap remained, a specific diagnostic marker the notebook referenced but never fully explained because in Lagos 1990s, the equipment to test for it hadn't existed at that clinic. She needed a way to confirm it existed here, now, in this patient, and she didn't have the credentials to order the test herself. Day 5. Dr. Harlan Voss found her in the archive room, technically off-limits to non-clinical staff, sitting at the small table with a bound volume of an old medical journal open in front of her. Voss was 68, retired track, kept on staff 2 days a week, mostly out of institutional respect rather than necessity. He'd been chief of medicine himself 25 years ago, before a case very much like this one ended that particular chapter of his career. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said, not unkindly. "I know." He looked at the journal open in front of her, then at her face, and sat down across from her without being invited. 25 years ago, I missed a diagnosis almost exactly like the one I think you're circling. Cost a patient 6 months of the wrong treatment before someone else caught it. Cost me the chief position not long after. He paused. I've thought about that case more than any other in my career. Renee said nothing, waiting. "I never thought to test for the marker the way you're describing," Voss said, "because at the time, the testing protocol you'd need didn't exist yet in this country. It does now. Most people don't know to ask for it because it's still filed under a different department's ordering system entirely." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded printout, a modern lab requisition form annotated in his own handwriting. "This is how you'd request it if you were a physician, which you are not." He set it on the table between them. "I'm not telling you to use this. I'm telling you it exists." He stood, buttoned his coat, and left without another word. Renee sat alone with the folded paper for a long moment before she picked it up. Renee couldn't order the test herself, but Jordan Reyes could, and did, quietly, on his own authority as the resident of record, framing it to his attending as routine due diligence on an unresolved case rather than admitting where the idea had actually come from. The results came back 4 days later. The marker was there, exactly where Adeze's notebook said it would be, exactly the pattern her mother had described 30 years earlier in a clinic on the other side of the world, in a language of symptoms nobody at Sterling Memorial had thought to speak. Renee read the lab result twice, sitting alone in the archive room after her shift, and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a word for yet. Day 8. Word of the lab order reached Vantree by way of the hospital gossip network that had spread the original story. He didn't know who ordered it or why, only that a highly unusual test had been run on his patient in room 412, outside the normal diagnostic pathway. He pulled the order history himself. Jordan Reyes's name was on it. Vantree called Jordan into his office that afternoon. The room was formal, dark wood shelving lined with medical texts and framed awards, a window overlooking the parking structure. Vantree didn't offer him a seat. "Explain this test," Vantree said, sliding the printed order across his desk. Jordan's throat was dry. "I had a clinical hunch, sir. I wanted to rule it out." "You had a hunch that happens to match exactly what the cleaning woman said in the hallway 2 weeks ago." Jordan said nothing. "I want you to understand something," Vantree said, his voice level, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than shouting. "If it comes out that a resident coached an unlicensed employee's diagnosis through the back door, using hospital resources to do it, that's not just her career over, that's yours too. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Then I'd think very carefully about how involved you want to stay in this." Jordan left the office shaking. He didn't tell Renee what had been said. He didn't need to. She saw it in his face the next time they passed in the hallway, and she didn't ask him to say anything more. She understood exactly what kind of risk he'd already taken for her. Day 10. Vantree, unsatisfied with a threat alone, requested that hospital security review Renee's locker as part of what he termed a routine compliance check on environmental services storage. Inside, alongside her uniform and a spare pair of shoes, they found her mother's leather notebook and Dr. Voss's folded, hand-annotated lab requisition form. By that evening, an email had gone out to the department chair, the hospital's chief compliance officer, and the CEO's office. Subject line: unauthorized clinical involvement, environmental services employee. The email included photographs of both documents. It suggested that a retired physician still on limited staff had been feeding restricted clinical guidance to an unqualified worker, and that this unqualified worker had improperly influenced a resident's clinical decision-making. It recommended immediate suspension of both Renee Webb and Dr. Harlan Voss pending a full compliance investigation. By the next morning, Voss had been formally suspended, effective immediately. Renee was informed that her employment was under review and that she was not to enter any patient care area, including room 412, until the matter was resolved. 2 days before she was scheduled to present. Voss found her in the parking lot that evening, sitting in her car with the notebook in her lap, not driving anywhere. He knocked on the window. She rolled it down. "I'm sorry. This is my fault. You shouldn't have." "Don't," Voss said. "I've spent 25 years wishing someone had handed me what I handed you. I'd do it again tonight." He looked toward the hospital building, lit up against the darkening sky. "He's not doing this because he thinks you're wrong, Renee. He's doing this because some part of him is afraid you're right, and he doesn't know what that would mean about everything he's built his whole life to prove." "They took the notebook," Renee said quietly. "It's evidence now, sitting in a compliance office somewhere." "Do you remember what's in it?" "Most of it." Voss nodded. "Then they didn't take anything that matters." He straightened, buttoning his coat against the cold. "You have 2 days. No archive room, no lab order, no resident willing to stick his neck out again. Just what's in your head and whatever's in that notebook of yours that you've already memorized without meaning to." He walked back toward his own car across the lot. Renee sat alone a while longer before she started the engine. Day 11. The story reached the local news that evening, someone inside the hospital having leaked it to a reporter looking for something more interesting than the usual CITIC coverage. "Hospital cleaner accused of practicing medicine without a license," the headline read, beside a photo of Sterling Memorial's front entrance. The article quoted an unnamed hospital source describing the situation as deeply concerning and a clear breach of professional boundaries. By morning, it had been shared widely enough that Renee's own son, 17 and a junior at the local high school, came home from school not saying much until Renee finally asked what was wrong. "Somebody showed everybody the article at lunch," he said. "They were saying you're basically pretending to be a doctor, that you probably don't even know what half those words mean." His voice cracked slightly. "I told them Grandma was a real doctor, that she taught you, and they said—" He stopped. "What did they say?" "They said Grandma probably wasn't a real doctor either, that people just say that." He looked at her, jaw tight, eyes wet. "Is that true? Was she?" Renee pulled her son into a hug before she answered, holding him the way she used to when he was small enough to carry. "Your grandmother," she said, "delivered babies and set broken bones and diagnosed diseases in a clinic she ran herself for 8 years, in a country that trusted her completely. This country just never gave her the paperwork to prove it. She held him at arm's length. That doesn't make it less true. It just means the truth of it lived somewhere the system never bothered to look." Her son nodded slowly, wiping his face. He didn't say anything else that night, but he sat at the kitchen table with her for an hour while she went back through the notebook, not talking, just present, the way people are present for someone they love when there's nothing useful left to say. Day 14. The tumor board convened at 9 a.m. in the main conference room on the 3rd floor. It was normally a small procedural gathering, 6 or 7 specialists, a resident presenting a case, a wall screen showing scans. Word of the past 2 weeks had turned it into something else entirely. Every seat at the long oak table was filled. Extra chairs had been brought in and lined against the walls. A few nursing staff and residents not technically invited stood near the doorway, unwilling to miss it. Dr. Elena Cho sat near the head of the table, arms folded, notebook open in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. She had reviewed the case file the night before and reserved judgment. Vantree sat at the head of the table itself, his white coat pressed, his expression composed in the particular way of a man who has decided in advance how a room is going to remember him. Harlan Voss was not seated at the table. His suspension technically barred him from attending in any official capacity, but he stood near the back wall anyway, arms folded, watching. At 8:58, Renee walked in. She wore her uniform. She hadn't been given a reason to wear anything else, and some part of her had decided she wasn't going to pretend to be something she wasn't, just to be taken seriously. She carried a single legal pad covered in her own handwriting and nothing else. Her mother's actual notebook was still sitting, sealed in a compliance office 2 floors up. The room went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has been waiting for exactly this moment and doesn't quite know how to hold it now that it's arrived. "Ms. Webb," Vantree said, folding his hands on the table. 14 days, as agreed. Renee walked to the front of the room, near the wall screen displaying the patient's most recent scan. She didn't look at Vantree. She looked at Dr. Cho and at the other specialists around the table, the way her mother had once told her to look at the people who actually needed convincing, rather than the one person trying hardest to make you fail. 3 weeks ago, this department ruled out 4 different conditions on this patient, each time because a key piece of the presentation didn't fit. Fever pattern that didn't match, lab values that were close but not quite right. Every proposed diagnosis got closer without ever landing. She pointed to a specific data point on the screen. That's usually what happens when you're looking at the right symptoms and the wrong disease category entirely. She laid out the reasoning the way her mother had taught her at a kitchen table 3 decades earlier, not starting from the standard framework and forcing the patient to fit it, but starting from what the body was actually doing and working backward toward what disease category could produce exactly that pattern. No more, no less. She named the condition. Rare. Genuinely rare. The kind most physicians in the room had only encountered in textbooks, if at all. A murmur moved through the room. One of the specialists shook his head slightly, not in disagreement exactly, more in the reflexive skepticism of someone hearing something they'd been trained to consider unlikely. That diagnosis would require a specific confirmatory marker, Dr. Cho said carefully, one that isn't part of our standard testing panel for this presentation. "I know," Renee said. "It was run 4 days ago, ordered through the appropriate clinical channel." She looked toward Jordan Reyes, standing near the doorway, his face pale but steady. "The results are already in this patient's file." Dr. Cho pulled up the lab data on her own tablet. The room waited while she read it. Her eyebrows rose slightly. She read it again. "This is positive," she said, mostly to herself, then louder to the room. "This marker is positive." The murmur sharpened into something closer to genuine attention. Vantree's composed expression held for exactly as long as it took Dr. Cho to say the next sentence. "If this marker is confirmed positive," Dr. Cho said, looking up from her tablet, "combined with the pattern Ms. Webb just described, this isn't just plausible. This actually explains every piece of the presentation we couldn't previously reconcile. The fever timing, the lab discrepancies, all of it." She looked at Renee for a long moment. "Where did you learn to think about a case this way?" "My mother taught me," Renee said. "She was a physician in Nigeria. She never got the chance to practice here." The room was silent for a moment that stretched longer than silence usually stretches in a room full of people trained to fill it with clinical language. Vantree spoke first, his voice tighter than he probably intended. "One positive marker doesn't constitute a confirmed diagnosis. This needs further. It needs a confirmatory biopsy, which I'm ordering this afternoon. But Dr. Vantree, I have been doing this 19 years, and I have never seen a differential this precise built with someone without formal training. Whatever the biopsy shows, what happened in this room in the last 10 minutes was not luck." Vantree's jaw tightened. He looked at the table, at his own folded hands, at anything other than the room full of colleagues now looking at him rather than at Renee. "Dr. Vantree," the department chair said quietly from the far end of the table, "I believe several of us were present for it." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need anyone to fill it. Everyone in the room understood exactly what was being asked and exactly what it would cost him to answer it honestly. Vantree stood. He didn't look at Renee at first. When he finally did, something had shifted in his face. Not defeat exactly, something closer to a man recalculating everything he'd assumed about where competence was allowed to live. "I said what I said," he told the room. "I'll honor it." He turned to the department chair. "I'll submit my resignation as Chief of Internal Medicine, effective at the end of this week." He looked at Renee one more time. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I don't know yet what I'm supposed to do with that." Then he walked out of the conference room, past the residents still crowded near the doorway, and didn't look back. The biopsy confirmed it 3 days later. Exactly what Renee had described, exactly what her mother's notebook had predicted, from a clinic on the other side of the world decades earlier. The patient in room 412 began the correct treatment that same week, the treatment he should have started 3 weeks before Renee ever said a word in that hallway. Word moved through Sterling Memorial faster than any hospital memo ever could. By the following Monday, it had reached local news outlets that had covered the original accusation, and this time the headline read differently. "Cleaner's diagnosis confirmed. Chief of Medicine resigns as promised." Vantree kept his word. He submitted his resignation that same week, quietly, without the public statements some had expected him to make, either in his own defense or in Renee's praise. He simply left. 2 months later, staff heard he'd taken a position at a smaller regional hospital 2 states away, one without a chief title attached to it. Dr. Harlan Voss was reinstated within days. The compliance investigation quietly closed once the actual outcome of the case made the original accusations look exactly like what they'd been. He didn't say much about it publicly, but he started coming in 3 days a week instead of 2, and more than one resident noticed he'd taken to eating lunch in the small medical library at the same table where Renee used to sit alone. The hospital's administration in the weeks that followed did something none of them had originally planned to do. A senior administrator called Renee into a formal meeting, not to discipline her this time, but to offer her a full sponsorship through the employee scholarship program, tuition and a paid leave arrangement that would let her pursue a nursing degree, with an explicit note in the offer letter that her long-term clinical reasoning ability had been formally recognized by the department and would be considered toward an eventual path into physician assistant training if that was the direction she wanted to take it. Renee read the letter at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd studied her mother's notebook for 11 years without anyone knowing. Her son sat across from her doing his own homework the way he had most nights that month. "What's that?" he asked. "They want to help me go back to school." He looked up. "For real?" "For real." He grinned, the first full grin she'd seen from him since the news article. "Grandma would like that." "Yeah," Renee said. "She would." Renee Webb's notebook, still officially hospital compliance evidence for another 2 weeks before it was formally released back to Renee, eventually found its way home. Renee didn't put it away in a drawer this time. She kept it on the kitchen table, where anyone in the house could see it, the way her mother once had. Renee didn't frame what happened as some kind of triumph when people at the hospital asked her about it afterward. She talked instead about pattern recognition, about listening for what a body was actually saying rather than what a textbook expected it to say, and about a woman who ran a clinic in Lagos for 8 years and never once got to hear an American colleague say her name out loud in a room like that one. She kept working in environmental services for another few months while her scholarship paperwork processed, cleaning the same hallways, restocking the same supply closets, nodding at doctors who now, for the first time in 15 years, nodded back. And in room 412, a patient who had spent 3 weeks as an unsolved mystery went home to his family, walking, breathing easier than he had in months, never knowing the full story of exactly how close he'd come to a very different outcome, or exactly whose careful, patient thinking had actually saved him. If someone ever tells you what you know doesn't count because of where you learned it, remember this story. Remember the woman who kept her mother's notebook long after the world stopped listening to either of them, and who finally put it on the table in front of everyone who mattered. Drop a comment, Has anyone ever doubted something you knew was true? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly this kind of story, the ones about people who were right the whole time and just needed the room to finally go quiet long enough to say so.